specifically the care for the clergy. I don't think people think a lot about what pressures there are on the people who pastor and what the church ought to be doing about that.
I'm sure you know that it is very difficult for pastors and for their families to live ordinary, plain lives. And because that is the case, and because so much is demanded of the pastor, you find both he, his wife, or husband, and their children many times in crisis. And then there is nowhere for them to go and no one for them to turn to. If they're out of their pulpits for a few Sundays because they are just crashing, either the church or a group want them out. But we need to find safe havens for our pastors so that they can go and when they find themselves in crisis, get help. We need to find safe haven for their families. We need to provide a social forum for clergy people and their families.
You know, one of the most compelling reasons to belong to the African Methodist Episcopal Church is its history of social justice advocacy, outreach. It doesn't end in these four walls. What role do you think the bishopric can do to enhance that mission that we have?
Well, you know our church, we are founded not just on spiritual principles, and I maintain we have spiritual principles upon which we were founded, but also from a sociological perspective. We are a church of social justice. We are a church that advocates freedom, liberty, and justice. We were in the forefront during the civil rights movement. We were in the forefront with our founder, Richard Allen. And when we look at the crisis in our communities today, the African Methodist Episcopal Church must regain its position in the forefront, fighting for these children who are not finishing high school, fighting for our men who are going to prison and coming out, fighting for justice in our educational system. We, the church, I believe that this is the best day and age for the African Methodist Episcopal Church to move forward and to lead our community to new advantages of freedom.
And that dovetails with the global witness part when it comes to questions about Darfur, for instance.
When you come to issues like Darfur, we have to step out and be at the helm, in the front. When you look at the global issues, when you look at the food crisis that we are experiencing now on the globe, when you look at the epidemic in Africa, all across the land where there is starvation, homelessness, we as a church have a thriving opportunity to be the church that God has ordained and called us to be.
How do we tell that story?
We have to, and that's important, that I believe that the community in which we are a part of today don't know our story. We do not tell our story. We do not tell the story of the African slave who not only bought his freedom, but bought the freedom of his brother and sister who was in a Methodist church, pulled up off of his knees for prayer, the first protest that really made a difference in this country, and then began a movement and determined that it had to be Christ-oriented and church-based. And that's our story, that's our history, and we never tell it, or we don't tell it with the passion and conviction that people will say, I have to be a part of that movement.
Preach, Pastor. Women in the ministry, is there a role? Obviously, it's much improved than it was when I was growing up in this church, but I wonder if there's something else that we can do to make it a more, is there something we can do to make the AME Church a more welcoming place, the pulpit for women?
I think we're getting there. I think the church is getting there. When you look across many of these districts, that the Board of Examiners and the classes coming in, you see a groundswell of women coming in. I think that the church has to, just as we are inclusive of our language, we have to be inclusive of the women in general who are coming in. We have to really understand that the first witnesses of the resurrection were women. They were the ones who, the men were afraid and in the upper room waiting for something, but it was the women who had gone to the tomb. And I think that the ministry of women is as important as ministry of men. But I think the other thing we must do is we must make sure that men and women walk together. I think that's critical. And it can't be the women on one side and the men on one side. But we have to bring all of the parts together to be a strong church.
How does a strong church speak to its future, that is to say, young people? How do we engage them in a way that speaks to the way they see their world and the way that we know they need to see the world?
That's a difficult mold to break in the life of so many of our churches. So many of our churches are staid. So many of our churches are just traditional church. They want the same old hymns, the same. And I like the hymns, I like the music. I'm a traditionalist. But I also know that we've got to contemporize the life and ministry and worship of our church so that young people feel like they are at home in their own church. The music has to change, the liturgy has to change, the ritual has to change. We don't have to throw it all out of the window, but we have to make sure that what we provide for them in worship, even if it is their own worship experience.
Finally, our fundamental mission, which is reaching the unchurched, reaching the unsaved. It seems like all of the points you've made so far really build up to that fundamental, pressing question.
And that is the ultimate role of the church, saving lives. And if we can put all of these components together, we become a stronger agent to save men and women who are out in the streets who don't know Jesus Christ. Our goal, our mission, our ministry, our purpose is to preach the gospel, good news, to the homeless, to those men who are in prison, women who are in prison, men, women who are coming out of prison. We are living in a generation that does not know Jesus Christ, who do not understand what it means to be a part of a Christian fellowship. And it is incumbent upon the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it is incumbent upon Christianity that we go out, reach out beyond these walls, beyond these hollow sacred windows, burying every annual conference that made a contribution, that there are men and women on the street who are dying, who are not only physically dying, but spiritually dying, and God calls us at ministry.
Reverend Ronald Eugene Braxton, we send you off to St. Louis with God's blessing as you seek the bishopric of African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Thank you so much, and I desire your prayers and the prayers of all of the people of this General Conference, that they may see in me a person who would make a good bishop.
Thank you.
Braxton for Bishop campaign.